Fire Emblem is full of villains who do evil things for all sorts of different reasons. Some of them are sympathetic, while others are not. Some of them have good reasons for doing bad things, while others are just irredeemable scumbags. In today's video, I'm going through every single Fire Emblem main antagonist in the series, and I'm going to analyze their reasons for doing evil, and rate them on how sympathetic I think they are. I've always been fond of villains who are not just evil for the sake of being evil, and I think this video would be interesting. I'm going to rate each main antagonist in one of four possible categories, ranging from very sympathetic, somewhat unsympathetic, and irredeemably unsympathetic. Before I begin, there will be some spoilers in this video. I'll include timestamps for each of the games, so you can skip the ones you don't want to be spoiled on. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's begin with the main antagonist of Fire Emblem 1, Medeus the Earth Dragon. He was the king of his people during the golden age of the dragon civilization, but then had to witness his entire race go to hell as birth rates started plummeting and his fellow dragons went insane. To save himself, Medeus took on the form of a Manakete while watching the rest of his kin go mad. This madness led to the Earth Dragons declaring war on the Divine Dragons, a war they lost badly, which resulted in them being sealed underground by Naga. Naga then entrusted Medeus with guarding the seal that kept them there, since he was the only Earth Dragon which had not gone insane. While being that guardian, Medeus witnessed the many atrocities committed by the human race, as they slaughtered his fellow Manaketes. This made his hatred grow to epic proportions, and eventually led him to forming the Dragon Empire of Dol with the intent of wiping out the humans for good. While the Medeus we see in the Arcanea games doesn't seem like a very sympathetic character, I actually can't help but feel pretty bad for him. A lot of the things that happened to his people were just stuff they didn't have any control over. It's never explicitly stated why dragons go mad and degenerate in the Fire Emblem universe, it's just something that seems to happen naturally, and it's a recurring theme in many of the games. Medeus' hatred for humans is understandable, seeing as he watched them slaughter his fellow people. Just imagine how you would have been stuck guarding a seal for thousands of years while you had to watch everyone you love getting killed. You'd be pretty bitter too. I therefore rate Medeus as a somewhat sympathetic villain. While there's no question he perpetuates evil, I can understand his motivations being twisted into something akin to self-defense. If you were a dragon and you had to sit idly by and watch humans slaughter your kind for over 1,000 years, it is understandable why you might want to wipe them out. Yes, Medeus' actions are bad, but I can sympathize with his motivations. Next up, let's take a look at another antagonist of Fire Emblem 1, Gharnef. He's not the main villain, but he's definitely a major one, so I'm choosing to include him. This one will be pretty easy by comparison. Gharnef is the mastermind who pulls at the strings in the Arcanea games. If something bad goes down, it's probably because Gharnef made it happen. We learn next to nothing about Gharnef's backstory aside from the fact that he was a student in Khadin under Goto alongside Miloa. That's Linda's dad, by the way, in case you forgot. And what basically happened to Gharnef is that he went all emo after Goto decided to appoint Miloa as his heir instead of Gharnef. But this was not what turned him evil, it was just sort of the breaking point for him. The reason Goto didn't choose Gharnef was because he sensed his evil nature, so it's implied that it was already there. I therefore place Gharnef in the irredeemably unsympathetic villain tier. It's pretty obvious that Gharnef was always pretty evil. If there was a reason for why he became the way he was, it was probably something that happened early on in his childhood, and we will never know the full extent of it. Up next, we have Gaiden and the Dark Dragon Duma. Duma is a divine dragon from the same tribe as Naga, and he was once a proud and majestic creature known as the King Shield. But after sending his soldiers to eradicate the human city of Thales, he and his sister Mila was exiled by Naga, and they traveled across the sea to Valentia, where they formed the two nations Rigel and Sophia. Like with so many other dragons, Duma eventually started to degenerate and go mad, which led to the chaos in Valentia that eventually caused the war to break out. By the time we see Duma in Gaiden/Echoes, he's already completely mad and corrupt. It is somewhat hard to blame Duma for going mad, as it seems like it's just a result of his heritage, so I personally place him in the very sympathetic tier. When he was in control of his actions as a divine dragon, he did seem like a bit of a brash and hot-headed character, as he did get himself exiled, and that definitely shows him as a flawed character. But as a villain in Gaiden/Echoes, you can't really blame him for what he's doing, as he's gone completely mad at this point. This wasn't a choice he made, it was just something that happened to him. Another main antagonist from Gaiden/Echoes is Rudolf, Alm's dad. Rudolf sent Alm away as a kid and tasked Meissen with guarding him, knowing that Alm would be needed to fight against Duma. Rudolf's plan was to instigate a war which would cause Sophia to retaliate, which would force great heroes from each nation to rally around Alm to face their common enemy, and then go on to fight Duma and his dark cults. While this plan seems very stupid on its face, it does end up working out exactly the way Rudolf wanted it to, though that may be more due to convenient writing than the plan actually being a good one. Still, I can't help but think that there could have been a better way for Rudolf to achieve his goal, other than throwing the entire continent of Valentia into a bloody war which would claim thousands of innocent lives. So just for that, I would say he's only a somewhat sympathetic villain. He's clearly motivated by good and he wants to do the right thing, I just disagree with him a little bit on how he chose to do it. Then we have Jedah. He is a Gharnef clone, but unlike Gharnef, we don't even learn anything about his backstory. He's just evil for the sake of being evil, which means he goes straight into the irredeemable tier. Fire Emblem 3 is a remake of Fire Emblem 1, so I won't repeat what I said for the villains in this game, but I do have to talk about the new character it did introduce in Hardin. A former playable character, Hardin became the main antagonist of the second book once his marriage with Nina started going downhill, since it was obvious she was in love with another man, Camus. This sent Hardin into a deep despair, which Gharnef exploited by giving him the Dark Sphere, which corrupted Hardin into becoming the Dark Emperor. It's hard to blame Hardin for his fate, since we don't know how powerful the Dark Sphere is. Would it corrupt someone like, say, Marth on the same level, or does it only work on those who are already weak of will? Either way, I categorize Hardin as a very sympathetic villain, because he's essentially just a victim of someone else's schemes, and he's really just being puppeteered against his will. Next up, let's move on to Fire Emblem 4, Genealogy of the Holy War, starting with maybe one of the most iconic villains of all time, Arvis. Arvis' master plan in Fire Emblem 4 is to have most of the noble lords kill each other so he can come in and rule what's left. Due to him possessing minor Lopter blood, a secret he desperately wants to keep hidden from the world, as Lopter witch hunts are a regular occurrence in Jugdral, Arvis is a bit more sympathetic towards the Lopterians than most, and even lets a few of them roam around his castle unsupervised. Whether out of fear of them exposing him, or because he feels genuinely sorry for them, it's not made quite clear. However, quite predictably, after he becomes emperor, he finds himself becoming a puppet of the very Lopterians he let roam around. They possess his son with a demonic tome, turning him into the literal devil, and Arvis finds himself completely unable to do anything about it. He actually tries to kill his own son, but he fails because he's just too powerful. So instead, he decides to let Seliph have the tear thing so he can do it instead, which some would say is quite a redeeming moment in the end. This is probably going to be a controversial rating, but I choose to place Arvis in the somewhat unsympathetic tier. Despite the fact that he was manipulated and puppeteered in his later life, Arvis still schemed, plotted, and backstabbed his way to the throne by killing many innocent people. He was never fully evil, but he was definitely not good either, and I personally think he got what he deserved, even if he is a very interesting character and one of my personal favorite villains in the entire series. Up next, we have Manfroy from the same game. Manfroy pretty much fills the same role as Gharnef from the Arcanea series. He's the dark mastermind and manipulator who makes everything happen behind the scenes. Manfroy is a tinge more sympathetic than Gharnef, as we learn about the brutal oppression of the Lopterians, which probably explains why he does what he does, but the Lopterians are persecuted for a reason. It's not like they didn't kill hundreds of thousands of people under Bishop Gale, so I still place Manfroy in the irredeemable unsympathetic tier. Then we have Julius, the final boss of Fire Emblem 4. Julius was corrupted and taken over by Lopter when Manfroy gave him the Black Book as a baby, and thus Julius never even had a chance. He just became a vessel for a dark god. While Lopter is irredeemably evil, Julius himself cannot really be judged for that, so I consider him a very sympathetic villain. Moving over to Fire Emblem 5, Tracia 776, we have another Gharnef/Manfroy clone in the Dark Bishop Veld. Veld is just another manipulator who manipulates because he's an evil Dark Bishop. There's not much to say about his character. We learn nothing of his backstory, and he's just kinda very loyal to the Lopterians. Chuck him into the irredeemably unsympathetic villain tier. Up next, we have my personal favorite game in the series, Fire Emblem 6, The Binding Blade, and its main villain, Zephiel. Zephiel is a tragic character who grew up being abused by his father, who was jealous of his accomplishments to the point where he tried to poison him. Zephiel, as a young teenager, then faked his death, and while lying in his coffin, stabbed his father with a dagger through the heart as he came to check Zephiel's corpse. This act stripped the young prince of his last vestiges of humanity, and as a result, the new King Zephiel decided that all humans were scum, and that it was better to hand the world over to the dragons. Thus he began his long crusade to conquer Alib and reinstate the dragons as the true rulers. Now, I definitely have some sympathy for Zephiel as a character. He's a victim of gruesome parental abuse, which is a very common thing that turns a lot of people evil. But his father being mean to him is no excuse for Zephiel to then decide that all humans deserve to be wiped out. He still had good people in his life. His bodyguard Murdoch was a loyal knight and friend who watched over him day and night. And his own sister Guinevere was also a great person whom he loved dearly. Zephiel being jaded by his father trying to kill him is understandable, but it doesn't excuse him then trying to wipe out the rest of humanity. As a result, I rate Zephiel as a somewhat unsympathetic villain. Then we have Idunn. Her backstory is incredibly tragic. During the Scouring, the dragons were facing certain defeat at the hands of the humans, and so they turned to the Divine Dragons and pleaded them to help by producing war dragons. But the Divine Dragons refused as they saw this as immoral, and so they captured one of their youngest members, Idunn, destroyed her soul, and turned her into a puppet for creating war dragons. Idunn is not a villain, she's a victim, so I rate her as very sympathetic. I think the fact that she is one of the few final bosses in Fire Emblem that you have the option to spare is very telling. Then we have Fire Emblem 7, the Blazing Blade. While the Fire Dragon is technically the final boss, I hardly rate it as a character. It's just kinda phase 2 of Nergal's boss battle. Nergal himself is the true antagonist of this game, and he's definitely one of the more interesting ones in the series. We know little of Nergal's early life. We don't even know exactly how old he is, but we do know that he was a powerful magician who somehow fell in love with a dragon named Aenir, and together they had 2 half-dragon children in Ninian and Nils. This dragon wife was at some point taken from Nergal, apparently by some bad men. At least that is what he tells his children. In an attempt to get his wife back, Nergal ordered his 2 children to wait for him in some ruins on the Dread Isle while he went to go get her. For some reason, Nergal needed to obtain more power, possibly to open the Dragon's Gate and cross over into the other world. This led him down the dark path of dark magic, and in Alib, dark magic has the side effect of eventually erasing your personality, making you forget why you sought power in the first place. This is exactly what happens to Nergal. In an attempt to get power, he loses himself and forgets his purpose. The only thing he remembers is that he needs to open the Dragon's Gate, and tragically, he ends up using his own children to accomplish this goal. This leads him to starting a massive war in Alib in order to obtain a fuel known as quintessence, and ultimately leads to his demise as he attracts the attention of some very powerful nobles. Nergal is difficult to rate, as we don't really know how much of his evil came about from him losing himself in the darkness, and how much of it was already there. The Nergal we see in Fire Emblem 7 is clearly evil. He doesn't display any affection for those around him, and he uses people around him as puppets. But it seems like this was not always the case with him. When Athos met Nergal as a young man, he seemed to like him, though I must admit, I'm not exactly sure if this meeting takes place before or after he decides to go on a quest to find his wife. According to Athos, Nergal becomes evil while staying in Arcadia. This is where he learns to absorb quintessence from creatures, and ultimately leads to them having a falling out. As for Nergal himself, I choose to rate him as a somewhat sympathetic villain, because his initial intentions was just to get his family back, but then he just seems to fall to despair due to the terrible side effects of dark magic, though it was very unclear how much of it is just because dark magic bad or because the evil was always present within him. We'll never really know. Up next is Fire Emblem 8 The Sacred Stones, and yes, I know that Demon King is technically the final boss, but he's a demon and really have no redeemable personality traits. Lyon, on the other hand, is a much more complex case. Initially, all he wants to do is save his dying dad, who is struck with a terrible illness. As a result, he starts experimenting with his nation's sacred stone, which, unbeknownst to him, contains the essence of the Demon King. This leads to Lyon being corrupted and slowly taken over. When we see him in the game, it is left kinda ambiguous just how much the real Lyon is still around, or if it's just the Demon King masquerading as his body. But I don't think there's any doubt that Lyon himself is not evil. Sure, he has his flaws, he is kinda insecure and he's physically weak, but all he's really guilty of is not wanting his dad to die. Everything that happens to him happens because he's either unaware of what he's doing or simply because he's being taken over by a demonic entity which literally devours human souls. If it wasn't for the Demon King, Lyon most likely would have grown up to become a very strong and wise ruler, so I rate him as a very sympathetic villain. Up next, we have Fire Emblem 9, Path of Radiance, and I'm choosing to save the Black Knight for the next game, since his arc doesn't really conclude in this one. So in the meanwhile, let's take a look at the Mad King Ashnard. Ashnard is not a very complex character. His philosophy is very simple. He feels that strength, not station, should decide your place in the world. If you are strong and you can fight, you deserve to be at the top. If you're weak, you deserve to be killed. Essentially, might makes rights, one of the world's oldest philosophies. While it is possible to sympathize with Ashnard's ideology, as many unworthy rulers are put into positions of power just because of what family they were born into, a world in which the mighty kill the weak because they are mighty is just as unfair, if not worse, and creates way more chaos than the former. In Ashnard's ideal world, everyone just fights all the time, creating a world in which all rulers are violent tyrants. For this reason, I think Ashnard is an irredeemably unsympathetic villain. Yes, he is right that the system in which Thales is ruled is a bit unjust, but that's no excuse to swap it with something even worse. Then we move over to Fire Emblem X Radiant Dawn, starting with the Black Knight Zelgius. Zelgius had a very tragic upbringing due to his branded nature, and was shunned by his peers. As a result, he joined the military, where he was able to hide his brand with his armor, and where he quickly rose through the ranks due to his martial prowess. Zelgius was trained by Ike's dad, Grail, then known as Gawain. Zelgius idolized Gawain, and wanted to be just like him. But then Gawain suddenly disappeared. Zelgius decided to look for Gawain once he had become stronger so that he could challenge him to a fight and beat him, proving that he had surpassed him. This was his entire motivation, and what led him to eventually kill Gawain, who had now taken the name of Grail. And once he discovers that Grail is not even a shadow of his former self, he then decides to use his son Ike as a proxy, literally grooming him into becoming a warrior that he can then fight to prove he surpassed his teacher. Zelgius is, how do I put this? He's an evil dumbass. I can get wanting to surpass your master, I really can, but doing so at the expense of his two young children is just evil. There's no other ways to put it. While Zelgius is a cool character, I think he is an irredeemably unsympathetic villain. There is no excuse to take someone's father away just because you want to prove yourself in some twisted competition. Then we have Sephiran, the mastermind behind everything in Thales. Sephiran once made a promise to his goddess Asherah that humans and Legus would not fight for 1,000 years. But then the Serenus Massacre happened, an event in which Begnion torched the forest and most of the Herons in it. This made Sephiran so mad that he just wanted all the humans to die, so he orchestrated a massive war to wake Asherah up so she could call down her judgment, wiping the slate clean. Essentially, Sephiran just wants everyone to die because he's lost faith in humanity. I place him in the somewhat unsympathetic tier. I can understand his despair, humans can be pretty awful at times, but it doesn't justify trying to kill them all. Now, even though Asherah is the final boss of Radiant Dawn, I'm choosing not to tier her, as she's a goddess, and it's honestly kinda hard for me to judge the morality of a divine being, so I'm just gonna skip over her. Since Fire Emblem 11 and 12 are remakes, we're going to skip straight to Fire Emblem 13 Awakening. Here we have two main antagonists in Grima and Validar, but I'm also going to add in Gangrel and Walhart just for the hell of it. Yes, I'm calling him Walmart, by the way, deal with it. Validar is easy to tier. He goes straight into the same category as Gharnef, Manfroy, and Veld. He's just an evil dark priest doing evil dark priest things. He is irredeemably unsympathetic. Grima is also not a very interesting character to rate. He/she/it was just created in a lab in Thales, and someone who was literally a test tube experiment is kinda hard to rate morally, so I also chug him into the irredeemably unsympathetic tier. Gangrel is a bit more of an interesting character since he is human. He's angry because Crumb's father committed a lot of war crimes in Plagia, so now he wants to commit war crimes back. It's not justifiable, but at least Gangrel has something to work with here, so I'm placing him in the somewhat unsympathetic tier. What he's doing isn't okay, but I can at least understand his reasoning for doing so. Walhart, on the other hand, is a little more interesting. He's seemingly just coming ashore to conquer everything, but it is later revealed that he was actually trying to prevent the resurrection of Grima. Similar to his ancestor Rudolf, he could have just solved this by talking to Crom and maybe allying with him, but that wouldn't make for a very funny villain, now would it? This makes him come across as a little dumb, but at the very least it makes him a somewhat sympathetic villain, because he does want to do the right thing, he just does it in the wrong way. Then we move over to Fire Emblem 14 Fates. While Fates released 3 games with lots of antagonists, I feel like there's really only one that is worth talking about, and that's Anankos. He's kinda puppeteering everything that goes on in Fates. Garon is a slime monster/dragon because of Anankos, and Takumi becomes a corrupted archer because of Anankos. So he's really the only villain worth talking about. And his reasoning is just, he went mad and degenerated, like so many others of his kind. It's very hard to rate Anankos, since he went mad lol isn't really a good motivation that can be judged. It's just something that kinda happened to him. The next game in the series is Echoes, and since it is a remake of Gaiden, I normally would be skipping over it, but it did add another major antagonist in Berkut, and I feel he deserves a spot in this video, so let's analyze him briefly. Berkut is the nephew of Rudolf, and since Alm is gone, he's the heir to the throne. He starts off as a very prideful character who seemingly has it all, a future throne, a hot wife, fame and fortune, but then we start seeing him fall as Alm starts humiliating him several times on the battlefield, and it eventually leads to Berkut sacrificing his wife to obtain power so he can have a fighting chance, but it's still not enough, and Alm just defeats him anyway. Berkut is a tragic villain who seemingly falls because of his own pride, but I actually think Rudolf is also partly to blame here, as he kind of sets his nephew up to fail. I actually think Rudolf is a little more unsympathetic in Echoes compared to Gaiden, as he seemingly drives his nephew to madness by making him fight battles he's unlikely to succeed at. Keep in mind, Rudolf's plan is for Alm to win, so by sending Berkut out, he is essentially sending his nephew out to die. Berkut sacrificing Rhea is inexcusable, however, so I would still rate him as a somewhat unsympathetic villain, but it also feels like he was just put in a position where he was destined to lose. If it wasn't for what he did to his wife, I'd probably view him in a much better light. And then we arrive at Fire Emblem 16 Three Houses, and while there are many characters to talk about here, I would argue that the main villains are Nemesis, Seiros, Thales, and Edelgard. Let's start with Nemesis. We don't know much about him. It's just stated he was the leader of an army that opposed Seiros. He definitely doesn't seem like a good guy, he at least has a very evil-looking design, but I don't think we can call him evil just because of how he looks. It's kind of left up to interpretation, so I'll rate him as a somewhat unsympathetic villain because I don't really know much about him or his motivations, and I don't think we ever learn much about them. Seiros, aka Rhea, aka the Immaculate One, is a lot simpler, at least for me. Her entire motivation is that she misses her dead mom, and wants to sort of bring her back in a twisted way through Baby Byleth, using a fucked up ritual. While losing your parent is an understandable motivation for doing bad things, it doesn't make it justifiable, especially not using other people's babies as tools in your own schemes. This makes Rhea a somewhat unsympathetic villain to me. I don't think she's necessarily outright evil, but she definitely does evil things. Then we have Thales. He's just a Gharnef clone. Into the irredeemable tier he goes. Nothing more to say here. And then we have Edelgard. Oh my, I feel like I could probably do an entire video on her, but I'm going to keep it simple. Edelgard was abused as a child and experimented upon in very unethical ways. This led her to resent the power structures of the world, and now she wants to tear it down and build a new one which is more fair. While this can seem like an admirable goal to some, Edelgard is the sort of the end justifies the means type villain that I really don't like, to the point where she even chooses to work together with the people who hurt her. Sure, she intends to wipe them out afterwards once she's done, but there's just so many things that can go wrong with this plan, and she risks giving them a lot of power if she fails. The whole, I think the world is unjust so I'm going to conquer it by killing tons of innocent people is a slippery slope that goes to a very bad place. Although I see why some people could see it as a noble goal, I place her in the irredeemable unsympathetic tier. And then we come to the latest game in the franchise, Engage, and its main villain, Sombron. Sombron's whole shtick is that he came from another world and brought with him an emblem ring, which served as his only companion, but then he lost that emblem ring and turned emo. His plan was to collect all the other emblem rings, return to his original world, and take vengeance. I don't really know what that means. Is he going to kill his emblem? Out of all the villains, I find Sombron to be one of the dumbest ones. Yes, he has suffered in the past, but what tipped him over the edge was just losing his ring? If that's all it takes to go on a crusade to end the world, you can't have been a very good person prior to that. So I place Sombron in the irredeemably unsympathetic tier. So yeah, that's my rating of the Fire Emblem villains. This video is bound to be a controversial one, but that's sort of by design, so bring on the comments. Let me know which ones you agree with and which one you disagree with. I'll get the popcorn ready, and I'll enjoy reading your comments and seeing you fight in my comment section. Thank you so much for watching.